Hello, and thank you for joining us on this OTC Live for discussing the UN Decade of the Ocean Science for Sustainable Development, otherwise known as the UN Decade of the Ocean. This is really a remarkable time to get the ocean and our professions in the marine technology space to the forefront of society and what we do in offshore oil and gas, offshore energy production, and shipping. Hello, I am Peter Wallace. I'm the manager of marine projects at SeaOne Holdings in Houston and a member of the corporation at Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution. This talk is being presented as part of OTC Live Talks and being brought to you by IEEE, the OES section. Woods Hole, or WHOI for short, is a global leader in ocean research, innovation, and education. Today's speaker is Dr. Richard Murray, the Deputy Director and Vice President of Research of WHOI. Rick will talk with us about the future of ocean technology, current and long-term trends in ocean innovation, and how we can create an ideal environment for ocean innovation to thrive and drive the blue economy. Rick.
Thank you, Peter, and greetings to everybody here. I'm calling in from Scituate, Massachusetts, and it's really interesting being part of a very large international group here. And I'm delighted to spend some time with you here today. I must also say I liked during the introduction seeing pictures of drill ships and so on. I've done a lot of work in my career with the ocean drilling program located up at Texas A&M in College Station, Texas, and so it's a very friendly audience for me and a very familiar audience, and right from the start. So I've been at Woods Hole Oceanographic for about 18 months, and before that, I was a professor at Boston University for nearly 30 years. And my last 4 years when I was at BU, I was working at the National Science Foundation in Washington, D.C., where I was the Division Director of Ocean Sciences. So the thoughts I'm going to be sharing with you today come from both my perspective at Woods Hole, my perspective, from years at the NSF, and then also as a practicing professor of oceanography throughout, most of my career. All right, so I'm going to jump into screen sharing right now and move on over to the PowerPoint here. And Peter, are we good? Can you see my screen here?
Yes.
Okay, great. So that's the title of my talk, and I've got about 25 minutes at most of content to share, and I look forward to a good question and answer session immediately afterwards. Just to refresh some of you or inform some of you about Woods Hole Oceanographic, or as Peter said, WHOI. We're founded in 1930. We're the largest private oceanographic institution in the world. We comprise about 1,000 folks, located on 2 campuses in Falmouth, Woods Hole, Massachusetts, down at the elbow of Cape Cod, as shown there. 6 science departments that include engineering and technology interspersed throughout. Quite a large annual research budget, which is distributed out over 800 projects a year, ranging from very small, tens of thousands of dollars, ranging up to the Ocean Observatories Initiative, which is run through WHOI to the tune of about $40 to $45 million a year. We also are very active in next generation education, and we have the widely known MIT WHOI joint PhD program that we share with MIT, located up there in Boston or Cambridge. One of the themes I want to point out here is the importance of ocean research and engineering to the overall blue economy and the economy in general. If we look at just WHOI as an example, and I'm sure this is the case at other institutions around the world, we have a certain amount of funding that comes in, as shown, $220 million there on the left. And this propagates all the way down to $650,000 for a typical award. And we're ranked very highly amongst US academic institutions, Massachusetts academic institutions, and quite a high percentage of the academic research funding in Massachusetts overall. And I know this is the case with other oceanographic institutions as well, wherever they be located in terms of whatever state or country. In part, that's because ocean research and engineering is quite expensive, but also because it is really supported strongly by local and national governments. In this context, if we look at where I used to be at the National Science Foundation, where as I said, I directed all the ocean research funding, WHOI was getting about 34% of my budget at the time. And WHOI was getting about 20% of my budget, and 34% of WHOI's budget comes out of the National Science Foundation's oceans there. Now, Scripps, Lamont, which is Columbia University, they also get significant percentages of the ocean funding from the National Science Foundation. We also receive funding from the Office of Naval Research, BOEM, a lot of other federal agencies, and we're increasing the amount of philanthropic support that we get as well. And I point out the other institutions, not just because our bar is taller than theirs, although when I'm talking with my colleagues, I like to point that out. The main point here is that these academic institutions really end up receiving a fair chunk of federal support that then gets propagated out and distributed into the community. And as you'll see when we start talking more of the technological work we're talking about, really helps contribute to the blue economy, as it were, in the different regions. So moving on into some of the technological innovations that are going on at WHOI and also at other institutions. I really like this photograph because when most people think of oceanography, they think of ships. And there's the Atlantis, which is one of our is our largest research vessel, owned by the Office of Naval Research, operated by WHOI on behalf of the community. So everybody sees ships because they're on top of the ocean. However, as you can see with Sentry, one of our AUVs shown below the surface there is, of course, so much going on underneath the ocean. And that, of course, is where most of the challenges lie. The ocean is opaque beyond the first upper couple meters or so. It's corrosive. The weather is challenging. Yet that is where most of the oceanographic research and certainly most of the instrumentation resides. And that presents challenges not only in just the physical material itself, but also in communications, finding what we put over the side. We oceanographers are somewhat fond, I guess, of saying we never lose anything. We know exactly where they are, but they don't always come back in terms of what we put over the side of the ship. So it's a very challenging environment in a number of ways. There's an analogy here with meteorology, which is sort of a sibling science, as we call it, with oceanography. The world famous oceanographer Henry Stommel, way back when, before I was born even, came up with this terrific quote. He remarked that the determination of climatological conditions in the atmosphere. So if we were studying the atmosphere by means that we studied the ocean back then, it would be analogous to using a half a dozen automobiles and kites to which air sounding instruments were attached, by doing all their work on dark, moonless nights when they couldn't see what was happening in their medium. Now, meteorology is a sibling science to oceanography. It's a really challenging field working there, but above all, it's above the ground. You can see it, you can work from the ground on it, and you can communicate really easily with whatever instruments you're doing when you're looking at meteorology and weather patterns and so on, at least to a first order. None of those conditions apply to oceanography. We can't see what we're doing. It's out at sea, not where we live, et cetera, et cetera. So again, the challenges facing oceanography are indeed steep and present opportunities and catalyze and stimulate technological developments. So this slide, of course, comes from our WHOI perspective, but I would put forth that our colleagues at Scripps or University of Washington, Texas A&M, over in Europe, over in Japan and China, and anywhere oceanography is going on, we try stuff. We develop it, we build it, and we test it. So for example, if you start anywhere in this circle, let's start at the top at design. So someone has identified a scientific challenge that requires us to develop something, and so we design it, And then in-house at Woods Hole, we simulate, we develop prototypes, we test. This is all behind the scenes and often takes years, costs a lot of money. And then we can take it out in the field with our ships and then operate and so on. And due to the challenges and due to the fact that not everything works the first time and so on and so forth, then we bring it back. And this cycle is a perpetual activity throughout the institution. And we're engaged at all stages here, throughout all technical readiness levels, and throughout all stages of technological development. A good example that we're using a lot these days is, of course, if we're looking at weather prediction on land and ocean prediction at sea, in particular linking the ocean and atmosphere and land, if, for example, looking at El Nino, the El Nino Southern Oscillation, and so. And so with that same circle, you can, again, start anywhere you want in this diagram, but I'm a seagoing oceanographer, so I'll start in the upper right. So we have buoys that are out there. Those are placed by NOAA. That's a NOAA research ship in the background there. Buoys that are both recording meteorological conditions as well as oceanographic conditions such as water temperature and so on. These buoys in the lower right are arranged in an array right around the equator. This is an older slide of the Tau Triton array, with each dot representing a very complicated buoy system. And that graph, that rectangle down there, is stretching approximately a third of the way around the world. So it doesn't really give that proper perspective. So we're looking here at global scale observations that we're tracking. And then based on theory relating to fluid mechanics and atmospheric behavior and ocean behavior, we develop simulations. And these simulations can then be data assimilated into predictive skills. And over the past decades, we've gotten increasingly better at being able to predict the future of El Nino, which is regulating rainfall patterns throughout the globe, crop yields, wine harvests, and so on. So this point here about the oceans and the land being inextricably linked is a strong one that more and more people are becoming aware of. In essence, the water that evaporates from the ocean is transported over land and then falls as rainfall on crops. So to really understand weather patterns, you really need to also understand the oceans. So that's just one example, and I'm going to go through several coming up. But up on the upper left here, we've got extreme weather. You know, what's the role of the ocean and how do we work on that? Those red dots are tropical cyclones coming off of Africa headed for the US and the ocean. Of course, renewable energy, which most folks on this call are certainly well aware of and well versed of. The changing Arctic conditions with the decreasing ice, and then also its increasing geopolitical importance. And the fact that there's ice up there at all still, of course, means that it makes for very challenging operational conditions. Food security down in the lower left, showing the development of aquaculture, food from the sea, overall changing ecosystems and nutrient distributions. And then in the lower right, of course, national security. Woods Hole is quite active with our partnership with the Navy. Quite often, exactly the same interests technologically of national security, namely battery power, power management, miniaturization, development of soft body instrumentation. The national security folks are interested in that, as are the open, basic, and applied sciences. So there's a real tremendous synergy between what we're trying to do with our science as well as what we're doing with our national defense research. This, of course, leads to some other feedbacks and synergies here. Again, on the left, we've got a meteorological buoy out in the middle of the ocean. On the right, here I am testifying to Congress last year on the importance of ocean observations to exactly what we're talking about here, of technological innovation, economic yield, as well as strengthening of every nation's economy. Now, this has been known for a long time, and I like to use this example. This is Benjamin Franklin's chart of the Gulf Stream. So you've got coastal US on the western side, and Europe would be off to the upper right. And Benjamin Franklin noticed that ships that were going from west to east were arriving quicker than ships that were going from east to west. And it was unrelated to the wind field. They were able to figure out that there was this Gulf Stream. And very patiently, Franklin went through all sorts of logbooks and spoke to a ton of ship captains at the time and was able to develop a pretty coarse map of the Gulf Stream. But this was very important. And this shows, even at an early stage, that people recognize the linkage between basic ocean science as well as economic, practical applications. Which leads into a brief comment about the UN Decade of Ocean Science for Sustainable Development that Peter mentioned right offhand. This is a photograph looking down at some commercial fishing boats. They look very colored. At first, I thought those were, lobster pot buoys, but those are the tops of fishing boats in the tropics somewhere. Understanding the policy depends on, developing good policy depends on understanding the ocean in its very most scientific way, like Benjamin Franklin pointed out. And so there's an understanding policy, and writing good policy is what's needed for successful business development. And so the UN Decade, which is starting several months ago in January, and we're just starting it now for the next coming 9.8 years or whatever, the phrase is the science we need for the ocean we want. And this actually can be reverted. I also kind of like to say the science we want for the ocean we need, because we have to understand science to create good policy, so the policy can help stimulate business, so commercial fishing can work, offshore wind can work, as well as a host of other industries, including transportation, and so on and so forth. So the UN Decade presents a wonderful opportunity for us to put this all into a cohesive mindset. I'm going to whip through 3 case studies of what's going on at Woods Hole, and to help give some specific examples as to some of the latest and greatest work that's going on at our institution, as well as some of the others. First, going to talk to you about some acoustics. Now, as you know, and as I said, the ocean is opaque, and so therefore traditional lines of communication don't work. And acoustics is the main way that energy gets propagated across the surface, as well as throughout the depths of the ocean itself. So people for a long time, and people on this call are well aware of this, have been using acoustics to track all sorts of things. But it's pretty much been limited in its dimensions and limited in its lateral extent. Y.T. Lin, one of our engineers in our Department of Applied Ocean Physics and Engineering, is developing something called a phased array acoustic telescope, which is shown here in the sort of central right. It's a quite large instrument that has hydrophones displayed or deployed radially in several arms as well as vertically. And using, with enhanced computational power available these days, using different time arrivals and phases of the arriving sound waves, they're able to pick up and monitor and track a whole host of sounds, whether it be fish, whales, breaking waves, which helps with weather and meteorological work, far off whales, rainfall, volcanoes, submarines, earthquakes, and so on. And the idea here is they're able to now start getting a 3-dimensional picture of the ocean all at once. Now that's just one, and the idea is if we can sprinkle these, if you will, or deploy these at many different locations around the global ocean, we will then be able to, in a network type environment, we'll then be able to get essentially a 3D picture of the ocean and everything that is in it at once. So rather than trying to count fish, for example, and find schools of fish located by individual ships driving around on the surface, using this phased array acoustic network, we might actually be able to see the schools in quasi real time as they are swimming around doing their thing. This is indeed current. One of our ships has just left port and is headed out to sea for doing some engineering tests. This phased array telescope, one of them is shown in the upper right here. That's in a back parking lot with shipping containers for scale. So these are very large pieces of work. And it's going to be deployed off the continental shelf in the context of a host of other acoustical techniques to do some engineering tests and figure out how we can optimize the deployment of this. Now, with offshore wind, as a second example of some of the developments that are going on at Woods Hole, offshore wind, obviously a very encouraging and highly interesting energy opportunity. Here's a chart showing wind speeds in meters per second from the National Renewable Energy Lab, showing different wind speeds around the coastlines of the US. Now, we happen to be located in the Northeast in some of the areas of highest wind speed, and we also happen to be in the Northeast of some of the interesting or highest areas of energy demand. I call this my Willie Sutton slide, the famous bank robber from the 40s and the 50s who was asked, why he robbed banks, and he said, well, that's where the money is. So offshore wind is being deployed out in this area because that's where the power demand is, and that's where the high wind speeds are. And it's very fortunate for Woods Hole that we're located right in this area. So we have a whole host of people working in various collaborative relationships with virtually all of the large-scale wind energy companies. And as you folks are aware, at least half the cost and certainly most of the risk is actually in the ocean itself. And so therefore bringing our acoustical techniques, bringing our geological expertise, bringing our chemical expertise, because we know a lot about corrosion, et cetera, to bear on this problem is really going to help manage down and mitigate that risk for the offshore industry as they move forward. A very simple example here, and I'm not going to get into this too much with this audience, but instead of having MMOs, marine mammal observers on ships, or at least in addition to having MMOs, passive acoustic techniques using next generation stretch cables and stretch hoses for deployment can give a much more accurate and much more real-time image than just individuals looking at the surface of the sea. Of course, bathymetric mapping, you can only get a certain degree of resolution, although it keeps getting better and better from ships due to beam attenuation and energy dispersion. With our ROVs and AUVs able to fly much closer down to the seafloor in certain targeted areas after we zoom in on an area of specific interest, we're developing bathymetric maps that have resolution on the order of centimeters to 5 to 8 centimeters in very focused areas. And we can now scale accordingly with independent AUVs or some even operating in concert with each other. The overall idea here is one of expanding the footprint of the vessel. So the vessel is still needed to deploy and provide that background baseline of information, but the additional AUVs and ROVs, et cetera, expand the footprint and make it far more efficient. The third and final example I want to talk about speaks to really the fact that this is a global ocean, and what happens in any ocean anywhere in the world affects all of us, regardless of our nationality and where we happen to live. In this sense, WHOI, and again, all the other oceanographic institutions all over the world, we really have a global reach. Using ourselves just as an example, we have more than 200 partnerships on 6 different continents. Our researchers collaborate with over between 8,000 and 9,000 colleagues in, at last count, roughly 75 countries. And on average, each of our scientists is in the process of or has collaborated with about 50 other folks. Part of that, it reflects the complexity of what we do. The days of the solo scientist working at the benchtop are still in existence, but relatively few and far between. To get to sea, to do this development of the technology requires more than just one person working late at night by himself or herself. So that's a lot of what's driving the fact of these collaborations in order to succeed. So the International Argo Float Program is a really great example of this. These are individual floats that can be essentially tossed over the side, as shown here on the left. They can also be deployed by aircraft if they're specifically hardened. And there are thousands of these that are being constructed, both at WHOI and private companies and Scripps and elsewhere. And the International Argo Float Program is is overseen by NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. Again, even the agency name, which we all know is just NOAA, it's important to realize that that's oceans and atmosphere, showing again the linkage between the two. So these Argo floats are really cool, and they've represent the latest of a many-decade evolution of the technological development. But the short version here is it goes over the side, as you can see there, up to, in the upper left, number 2. It descends down to about 1,000 meters, where it drifts for 10 days. And then depending on how it's outfitted, many of them will then penetrate, go down to 6,000 meters, come all the way back up to the surface, transmit their data back to shore, and then start this all over again, and therefore develop really important depth profiles of temperature and salinity throughout the global ocean. So Argo has really revolutionized global oceanography. And this slide's a little dated, but it's really, really visually impressive, I think. If you look at the top rectangle, that is 50 years worth of profiles taken in August. So nominally Northern Hemisphere sea surface temperature maximum. That's 50 years of profiles all around the globe before Argo. When Argo first came in as a big organized program, after the technology had developed long enough and it became organized, all those blue dots down below show just 6 years from 2004 to 2009 of temperature and salinity profiles. So you look at 50 years at the top, and then you look at 5 years down below. And you can absolutely see how our data coverage is so much better. Here we have observations in the deepest parts of the ocean, below 1,000 meters for the last 120 years. And when I show you this animation here, this is starting in the year 2000, and these are monthly jumps showing the number of profiles in red down in Antarctica. And you can see we're popping along here. We're about to hit 200,000 profiles. We're still in 2007. And you can see the very high density of ocean coverage that these simple little floats, I mean, it's easy for me to say that they're simple because it's taken a lot of time to develop them. But I mean, we have commercial ships tossing these over the side. We have research ships putting them over the side. We have them being dropped from airplanes at relatively low elevation. And we're able to generate incredible data sets that enable ocean prediction and weather and climate prediction to a vastly different level than ever before. This graph shows the location of every float that's out there right now as of March 5th. And you can go to the NOAA website and you can find out where they are as of this morning. And you can see there's about 4,000 floats out there. Very different from just only ship-based oceanography. It's a global view, 30 countries, 12,000 profiles a month, well over 1 million profiles, 4,000 scientific publications, at least hundreds of PhD theses, studying ocean warming, the water cycle, sea level rise, which is responding a lot to ocean currents, food webs, the whole gamut of data at this resolution. So in conclusion, two more slides in conclusion about the future. How are we going to innovate for the future ocean with all the enhanced computational capabilities that we have, all the enhanced abilities to communicate that's going on in our terrestrial world? How do we transfer these out to the ocean world, given all its challenges? Well, 4 basic mantras that we're trying to do at Woods Hole. We invest in good people. We want to get lots of different people together. And I have some comments about workforce in a few moments as well. And I'd like to talk a lot about that in the question and answer session too. So you get good people, you get a bunch of different people, You challenge them with difficult problems. That's kind of the easiest part, given the ocean. But then you get out of their way. You provide them with the opportunity, you provide them with the freedom, and you let them come up with the elegant solutions to the very challenging problems that are out there. A very good example of this, we just held this really interesting workshop called Smart Oceans 2020. This was done in the latter part of last year, funded by the NSF, as well as ourselves and MIT and the MIT Media Lab. Interestingly, you might think that a very large meeting like this might be run by some graybeard like myself or some senior scientist or oceanographer or something like that. The idea for this came from an assistant scientist who said, I want to do this. And he went way out on a limb and said, this is how we're going to do it, and ran the whole program himself. We had plenaries from leaders of WHOI, Scripps, the Ocean Exploration Trust, all over the world. And the four main themes, as shown there on the right: real-time, high-resolution, large-scale observations, emerging industries and sustainable utilization, exploration, and then social engagement and policy interventions, which speaks to what I was talking about earlier in the context of the UN and how first-rate ocean observation contributes to good policy. So my last slide here is some take-home thoughts. The ocean demands an all-hands mentality. It's going to take all sorts of different people with different types of expertise. Getting the data is just the first step. What that data tells us, how we use that data, that's very important, and that's where there's a lot of nuance and additional challenges. There's plenty of room for innovators of all types. And here I do want to comment on workforce specifically, and I'd really like to hear some comments on this if possible. We've noticed there's obviously a huge demand on technical support, not the PhD level type folks as well, but also who's going to be repairing all these instruments, who's maintaining them, and so on. So throughout the entire workforce sector, there are implications as we move towards a more instrumented Internet of Things, if you will, out in the water. And the winners in this new world, this new ocean world, are going to be those who adapt, innovate, take risks, attract that diverse workforce that I just was speaking about. And in that sense, it's all very similar to what's gone on land over the past decades. But now the technology is such that we're very well poised to move what we've taken from land and apply it out into the ocean and have it so the ocean is able to be as visible as things are on land, that the data is just as apparent and easily able to be used, and so on. So that's my talk. Those are my comments for us to hopefully get us started on some comments. But I'm going to turn it over to you, Peter, and we can take it from there.
Oh, wow. Fabulous. So in one of your earlier slides and parts of it, you were talking about the funding, and it's a large part of WHOI's funding is the U.S. government and increasing philanthropy and some commercial, but let's say that's a small part. It sounds like WHOI is really living the enduring idea of Vannevar Bush's Science, the Endless Frontier. The idea that government funds basic research or basic science, and then it filters out to wider industry for innovation that gets transferred to the rest of the world. Could you characterize science and business as like science being driven by the curious and basic research, understanding how the world works, and business being driven by specific missions like oil and gas exploration and production or offshore wind? But even though they have different drivers, they both use technology to advance. Can you describe how you might see both parts learning from each other, getting a closer relationship?
Yeah, sure. There's so-called basic science and so-called applied science, or so-called discovery science and solution science. And I use the phrase so-called intentionally because it's really a spectrum. And they certainly do feed off each other, as you said. I think at WHOI, we certainly do science and research and engineering from throughout the entire spectrum, for sure. And there are synergies back and forth. An analogy I use is in the medical industry, where which most of us are familiar with. You have basic biological or microbiological research, which then transfers across into pharmaceuticals or different surgical techniques, or virus vaccination development, for a current topic, and so on. So at least at WHOI, the federal support, by and large, certainly from National Science Foundation, given Vannevar Bush's founding documents in the 50s, has been driven by basic science. But more and more, we're evolving into doing continual applied science, and the lines get increasingly blurred. And we are obviously supportive of all types of the science. Certainly, our research with the Office of Naval Research is pretty applied. Oceanography itself was extremely important during the Cold War due to anti-submarine activities, and so on, and that's pretty applied. Trying to find intercontinental missile-bearing submarines, that's pretty applied. So through that spectrum, I think applied science drives basic science, and basic science drives applied science. And I know ourselves and our colleagues at other institutions worldwide are doing both.
Okay. I have sort of one question that follows on to that, and hopefully others on this call start to send in more thoughts. In private industry, one of the concerns about being an innovator or on the front line is always a perception. Sometimes it's real, sometimes it's very real, and sometimes it's not, about the timeline and cost of being a pioneer versus what everybody wants to be is either a fast follower or nothing new. Do you see a need for innovation to get closer to the end use in these more complicated, more complex world than it was, let's say, in the 50s or 60s or even earlier? And if so, how we can speed up the technology readiness level program, especially on the front end, so it's not so expensive in time and money?
Yeah, exactly. And again, there's a spectrum, right? I mean, you need to have low-level TRLs because you got to go through steps 1 and 2 before you can get up to 5 or 6, and you got valley of death issues, and so on and so forth. And these are universal, whether you're in the ocean technology or terrestrial technology or banking industry or what have you. There's valleys of death to cross, and TRL equivalents. Sometimes basic science takes a long time, and we stand on those who came before us. And you can't rush the maturation of fine wine. And there's certainly a component of basic science that needs that maturation, and so on. However, and this is where technology is making a big difference. It used to be in the ocean, you go out to sea, you take your water measurements, you bring those water samples back up, you take them home to the lab when you get there 2 weeks later, you analyze them, you mull it over, and so on. Well, now you can go log on to Argo, for example, if you're interested in temperature and salinity, and you can get a global picture as of yesterday. So the technological innovations are absolutely making things go much, much faster where you can. So in essence, when the rate limiting step is access to data, we're doing much, much better. When the rate limiting step is, oh my goodness, this is incredibly complicated, how are we going to put this all together? Sometimes things are slowing down. Yet again, that's where the technological innovations on the computational side with machine learning and artificial intelligence, which our institution is beginning to invest in, can also help us, because these data sets are getting to the point, obviously, where the human mind is having problems, massaging it and incorporating it. It's different than me 30 years ago looking at my Excel spreadsheet compared to the equivalent of me these days trying to look at global data sets. So how our science is being done is very different. And in fact, most cases, things are speeding up. Yet the most basic science is still requiring the thoughtful level of inquiry.
Great. This next question might sound like a little off of in a different direction, but I think it's related. And it can be, I guess, lumped under the DEI description of diversity, equity, inclusion. And one of our viewers, Karen Feinberg, who's coming in from LinkedIn, is asked the question about the demographics of the workforce, I guess, in ocean sciences, and what you're seeing if that is expanded to capture a wider net. Does this increase the level of curiosity? Does this increase the level of skills that can be applied to the oceans, the blue economy?
Yeah. And Karen, I appreciate your comment. I think everybody can see that there where you're right. WHOI is an awesome institute. I readily agree, which is why I moved there 18 months ago. So it's interesting. Most people aren't really aware of the ocean other than what they see in movies. And while most people on a global basis live within 80 or 100 miles of the coastline, because that's where most of the large cities are, because the vast majority of the ocean is out of sight over the horizon, and because the vast majority of the ocean is below the surface of the sea itself, people don't really think about the ocean, to be honest, that much. Everybody can go for a walk in the woods or a walk in the city, and if the lights are low, everybody can look up and see the stars wherever you are in the world. So there's sort of an intrinsic curiosity about astronomy and things that people can see that, frankly, is lacking in the ocean world. And therefore, I think that's one of the reasons that's contributing to oceanography happens to be one of the least diverse scientific occupations out there at this point in time. It's changing. For example, at Woods Hole, I think our entering class of PhD students this year is on the order of 30% of underrepresented minorities. But overall, ocean sciences suffers, and I use that word intentionally because I think the lack of diversity ends up resulting in a paired decrease in diverse intellectual pursuits and also diverse ways of attacking problems. There's studies after study after study that shows the more different sets of eyes you have on something, the better off your outcomes are going to be. And I think in our own situation, and we compare ourselves with our peer institution Scripps being located, right in San Diego, La Jolla, just outside San Diego, but it's right in San Diego, whereas we are out on Cape Cod. We're not located in Boston. We're about 70 miles away from Boston, and that's a long distance. So I think WHOI does have some unique challenges, but we are working very hard at it, and we have been for quite a long time. In addition to the racial and gender diversity issues, one of the things I work on very hard as my deputy director and vice president for research role is the diversity of how we look at intellectual problems. And if we hire only our people from our own types, if we're hiring only engineers that look just like us intellectually, or scientists that think just like us intellectually, we're going to get really, really, really good at less and less and less. And so we are undergoing intensive conversation at the highest levels of the institution as to what are the different types of people we need to hire. Who are the AI, ML people, artificial intelligence, machine learning people? Who do we need to hire? What skills do we need to hire? to make it so we can ask these challenging questions in the face of this tremendous fire hose of data, for example. And we think if we combine intellectual diversity with the racial diversity and the gender diversity, we're going to be a stronger institution, and ocean sciences will be stronger as well.
It's really good. I'm going to kind of merge two questions that came in. One from Akinolo Fuwushi on YouTube and Jim Yoda on LinkedIn. So Akino has kind of the longer question, or a more sort of broad stroke question, is, okay, the blue economy, ocean research touches everything in the world. Can you see limited collaboration, focus collaboration between places like WHOI or Scripps or Lamont, and the offshore industry? And just to make a really good sort of clear example, Jim Yoda's question is, where do you see AUV technology going in the next 5 years? And the reason why that stands out is because people that work in the oceans love AUVs for lots of reasons, like you don't have to put people underwater. So could you follow on that? I think that's talking about getting the probably more in the applied realm, but not so much as a spectrum, but kind of as like a really close feedback loop.
Yeah, it's a great feedback loop. If we look at offshore wind, there's a whole host of areas where we're contributing, and our field is WHOI is contributing, and our colleagues are contributing. Everything from seafloor characterization to passive acoustic monitoring to understanding wind fields, shear stress from the atmospheric winds on the surface of the ocean, and so on. And again, there is a spectrum there, because curiosity-driven research for looking at whale migration patterns can certainly also be used for studying distribution of whales through and in the areas of offshore wind farms. And again, applied very similar technology to hearing submarines from our naval colleagues. So there's a lot that we are doing, and with offshore wind, I think it's fantastic, because just like the oil and gas industry, with which we also have a lot of shared interests in terms of mapping the seafloor, using seismics to penetrate through the upper layers of sediment to look for structures in the sediments and so on. There's been a long-standing relationship between geosciences, ocean sciences, and the energy industry, be it oil and gas, be it offshore wind. And I'm ever hopeful that we can continue this strong and productive relationship as energy sectors transition through what they're experiencing. Regarding Jim's question about the future of AUVs, we think a lot about that. And I think one of the key things that I see coming down is not so much the AUV technology itself, the bright yellow thing itself, although there's certainly going to be developments in sensors and all sorts of things that you can put on AUVs, but how these AUVs communicate, and either between two different AUVs or swarms of AUVs, or how they communicate up to the surface of the ocean and then get the data back to land. So I think there's going to be as much, if not more, interest and effort into not only the AUV physically and electronically, although there's quite a lot going on there in propulsion and so on, but the next parts in the supply chain, if you will, or the data chain of transferring, where you have wave gliders on the surface of the ocean that essentially are acting as data mules to harvest the data from the AUVs that are out doing their thing, and so on. And then I mentioned earlier, miniaturization and power management. Those are going to be really important just like they are in everything. Handheld phones keep getting smaller and smaller. Power batteries on our iPhones keep getting better and better. all those sorts of things in the ocean world are also going to be very important.
Yes, a general question is, now that we're entering the UN Decade of the Ocean, which ironically is being fronted by UNESCO, how is that bringing the ocean, the blue economy, and what we do in offshore or shipping or food webs? How is that bringing that front and center with society? And what does that kind of mean? What do we have to do?
Yeah, I think the good thing about the decade, is somewhat has already been achieved in that a lot of people like ourselves are having this conversation to begin with. So I think having a global footprint or a global scale conversation about many of the unifying themes or unifying importances of the ocean is really important. Um, Fish don't know political boundaries. They don't need a passport to swim from the U.S. to Canada or over to Europe between Norway and Scotland. Um, so there's a whole lot of common interests, and I think entities and activities like the UN Decade will intrinsically help us prevent the tragedy of the commons. And so merely by enhancing coordination and identifying issues of mutual relevance and mutual importance will be cost effective, so we all don't reinvent the wheel. Will be also efficient in the sense of we will be eliminating redundancy. Third, they're going to be more accurate in their outcomes because a lot of these problems are of a global scale. And then fourth, I think it will raise public awareness of the ocean and raise public awareness of the importance of the ocean to land, which is where we all live. Um, I said this before a little bit, but a very specific example I have is when I did testify to Congress, the House Minority Leader, Mr. Lucas from Oklahoma, all his constituents are in Oklahoma, and Oklahoma is not known for being a coastal state. But after the testimony, he and I had a really terrific conversation where I was pointing out that the evaporation going on in the Gulf of Mexico is feeding his crops. And I think that's a US centric little local Gulf of Mexico, Oklahoma example. But you scale that up to what's going on in ENSO is affecting weather over in Europe. What's going on in the aridity of China is affecting fishing off Peru. And so something at the UN scale provides a very helpful framework or scaffold that many of these conversations must have in order to be globally relevant.
On that, I'm going to take Omade Pedro's question in a way. He's coming in from YouTube. Would this increased visibility improve opportunities for ocean sciences or ocean technology, such as naval architecture, marine engineering, biology, oceanography, etc.? Do you think that could enhance its visibility and make it wider in academic circles for scholarship, both scholarship and actually doing? In other words, more, not quite mechanical engineering in scope, but try to move that direction?
Yes, I do. And I think that the people that can walk and talk comfortably between the technological world and the scientific world are going to be in extremely high demand. And there are programs for whatever your interest. Again, a little Massachusetts centric, but I know that the Massasoit Community College here in Massachusetts runs a really strong marine technology program where they have people who are learning how to maintain electronics and work with wiring in the ocean environment and so on, all the way up to PhDs who are, at other institutions who are asking the science questions, who are asking the engineering questions and making the cutting edge developments. But kind of like I said earlier the solo benchtop scientist can be successful, but it's increasingly challenging. Those people that only know tech or only know science, they can be successful, but that's going to be more challenging in the future than it could be, or it need to be. So I would counsel young folks to really look at the intersections and be skilled in a number of different things. Yet not just to become a veneer and know a little bit about everything, but really get into the nitty gritty of the scientific side as well as the technological side, and be able to speak, all those languages. I'm definitely a fan of naval architecture and marine engineering. My son is applying for colleges and waiting to hear right now in naval architecture, in fact. So I think that is a really interesting field, along with marine engineering too.
I'm looking to see if there are any other questions that have come in on the comments section from people. So, and it looks like we're coming up to the end of the prescribed hour. Do you have, just looking, I guess one last question that I have is, do you see a potential for the science and the three overwhelmingly dominant sectors of the blue economy, offshore energy being almost 50% of the blue economy, shipping at anywhere between 10 and 20%, depending on how you measure it, and food web, aquaculture being the aquaculture and fishing being the prime examples. All those probably make up close to 80%, if not more, of the blue economy. Do you see them starting to intersect in a mutually beneficial way over the next 5-10 years?
Yes. And I think technology is going to be the unifying factor for all those industries, in addition to data management and so on. But in all those industries, we need to have a better understanding of what's going on in the ocean, and to identify what's going on in the ocean. In the old days meant you put a person out there and they watched, and then they told you what's going on in the ocean. Now it's all about sensors and having real-time data generation for a host of different parameters that sensors can manage. So if you're looking at offshore wind, you're going to be, sensors for predominantly the physics of the situation. Food webs and aquaculture, sensors regarding nutrient distributions, in addition to physical characteristics, and all these are going to benefit by the same technological advancements in hardware, software, and power. And so I think, like in many other things in our terrestrial-based sectors, if you will, the technological innovations are going to be the unifying factor behind all the scientific, either basic or applied science, like for shipping, where the ocean currents are, what's going on, what the wind fields are, and so on and so forth. So each of the sectors has different scientific needs, and they have, for sure, different technological needs, but so much of their technological requirements are common enough that investing in one of those will, by definition, positively affect the others.
Fantastic. I think we're at about the end of the end of our time.
That was quick. Yeah, that I enjoyed that. That time flew. I will just say in closing, if anybody else has questions or comments, or they're interested in learning more about any aspect of what I've spoken about here, or if you're considering a career in ocean science or what have you, please reach out to me, and I'd be glad to help out and have follow-up conversations.
Okay, I think it's time to turn it back over to OTC.
All right. Thank you, everybody.